All right, so Joe Biden's administration is reportedly opening an inquiry to study the origins of coronavirus, obviously testing out this sort of idea between the competing sides of this, of whether or not it came from natural origins and it spread from animal to animal and then to humans, or whether or not it was from a lab in China, specifically in Wuhan. And this is a really interesting story from a number of different angles. I haven't covered it yet on my channel because I've been waiting to see as more information comes out. But let's go ahead and just read into some of the details here, and then I'll give you my perspective, because I think I have maybe a little bit of a different perspective than most people do on this issue. So President Joe Biden ordered aides to find answers to the coronavirus, to the origin of the virus that causes COVID-19, saying on Wednesday that U.S. intelligence agencies are pursuing rival theories, potentially including the possibility of a laboratory accident in China. Intelligence agencies are considering two likely scenarios, but still lack a strong confidence in their conclusions and are hotly debating which is more probable, Biden said. The conclusions were detailed in a report to Biden, who asked his team in March to detail whether the novel coronavirus emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory accident, according to the president's written statement. So a little bit more of the details here as to what questions they have for China, apparently. So he says, quote, "I have now asked the intelligence community to redouble their efforts to collect and analyze information that could bring us closer to a definitive conclusion and report back to me in 90 days. As a part of that report, I have asked for areas of further inquiry that may be required, including specific questions for China. U.S. agencies have been pursuing COVID-19's origin since the government first recognized the virus, obviously in 2020. And earlier this week, U.S. government sources said a still classified U.S. intelligence report circulated during President Donald Trump's administration alleged that 3 researchers at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became so ill in November of 2019 that they sought hospital care." So the source of this early intelligence, or how reliable U.S. agencies rate it, is not known. All right, so we don't really have confirmation of that last part that I just read there, but it's interesting, you know, if some of these researchers at the lab did get sick in November of 2019, that seems like it would be pretty strong evidence to suggest that it did come from a lab. But again, this is a U.S. intelligence community that we're talking about, not exactly a reliable source. Especially for me as an American leftist, you know, that's kind of our job, is to be skeptical of the intelligence communities, because they have lied repeatedly and obviously have an incentive to ramp up the Cold War rhetoric between us and China. And so it's hard to know how much of this is legitimate scientific inquiry and how much of this is U.S. state propaganda to try to, again, ramp up this rhetoric against China in the wake of this sort of Cold War 2.0 that is emerging right now. And I don't really know what to make of this, honestly. It's not a topic that I've discussed in detail to this point, because I don't really think it's that interesting. And I think that if you are focusing primarily on the origins of COVID at the expense of talking about how different countries and different policies and different strategies contained or failed to contain the coronavirus, I think that you're sort of missing the point, right? The main lesson that I got from going through COVID in this entire experience had nothing to do with the origins, okay? I get it, because there are, you know, concrete actions that can be taken. If it did come from a lab, then okay, maybe there are certain safety precautions that we should be analyzing, or strategies or methods of research that the United States and our health organizations maybe shouldn't be participating in or funding. There are legitimate logistical things that you can do to address that problem if it turns out that it is a true problem, that it did come from a lab in Wuhan. But again, I think that the main issue here is that it's not a coincidence that the global center of our capitalist system on Earth, right, our global capitalist system, it's not a coincidence that the center of that, the United States, had the worst response to COVID. Okay, we had around 600,000 Americans have died from this one virus. It completely disrupted our economy, and we completely failed to contain it or handle it in any reasonable way whatsoever. And we can compare ourselves with other countries around the world. New Zealand comes to mind, Vietnam comes to mind, a lot of other countries that did take the right steps and did manage to contain it and had no widespread death or no widespread illness throughout the entirety of COVID because of the policy choices that they made. And so I think if you're focusing primarily on the origin of the virus instead of on the effects of the virus and what happened once we knew about it, then you're sort of missing the main point here, because, you know, this is something that we knew was coming eventually, right? Whether or not it came from a lab or whether or not it came from an animal, okay? This is something, a pandemic, an airborne pandemic, is something that we knew was an inevitability, okay? This is why you can go back and you can look at clips of Obama or even Bill Gates, and I'm not a fan of either of those guys, but this is why you can go back and look at clips of them from years ago, and it seems like they predicted the future. They said, oh, wow, we have a giant risk of an airborne pandemic that could spread across the globe and put this, that, and the third at risk. And it's not because they were oracles. It's not because they had some magic information that nobody else had that they could predict that this would happen. It was because this was an inevitability. And because some sort of a pandemic like this was an inevitability, an eventuality, it means that it's not going to be the last one, right? We're going to have to go through another pandemic eventually into the future. And so the lessons that we take from this pandemic should not necessarily be centered around the origin of it and whether or not it came from a lab or it came from an animal, right? The lessons that we should be taking are, where did we fail to contain it, right? Did we do enough testing and tracing? No. Did we provide people an avenue to stay home and self-isolate by providing economic relief to them? No, we didn't do that. We didn't do any of the necessary things that would be actual concrete policy measures that we could have taken in order to rein it in. And so I think that this is a really weird conversation that's been going on here. But on top of that, I also think it's interesting how the media has been discussing this, right? Because when Donald Trump was pushing this theory from the beginning, it was basically untouchable. It was, if you are an MSNBC, a CNN, any of these other Democratic media institutions, and you covered this and you tried to actually look into it, you would have been painted as a conspiracy theorist, right? You would have been painted as a racist, even a xenophobe, right? For going after China. Oh, you're just feeding into Trump's lies. And granted, some of that is justified because Donald Trump himself wasn't just going out and saying, oh, well, I think that COVID came from a lab maybe, and we should take steps X, Y, and Z in order to prevent that from happening in the future. No, Donald Trump actually was going out there and combining that with the xenophobic language and calling it the China virus and spreading hate around that subject. So to some degree, the intermixing of the racism and the xenophobia does have, Trump has a responsibility for some of that. And the media also has a responsibility for failing to entertain this as a serious idea from the beginning and being too caught up in Trump hysteria to not be able to look at the issue objectively from the beginning. So I think there's a couple of different angles here, right? It's interesting to see how the media has done a complete 180 and now suddenly this is a normalized theory that is perfectly okay to talk about. But on top of that, again, I think that while this can lead us to make certain logistical changes to how we are operating with our research and investigations, I don't think that this is the main point of COVID. And again, it's not a coincidence that the center of our global capitalist system had the worst response in the world to the virus, okay? Those are directly correlated, and that's where we should be focusing our issues. What are the policy failures that led to our failure in handling this, and what can we do to better handle not only COVID right now in the immediate sense, but any future pandemics that may come up in the future?